Dulce et Decorum Est is an astonishing poem. It's incredibly visual, which is why I've started here with an artwork from Deviant Art and Agella as the artist. It works brilliantly visually. It also uses every single one of the senses to completely dramatise not just the events in this poem, but the poet's passionate, extreme anger. Another reason that the poem is so memorable is that Wilfred Owen returned to fight in 1918 and was killed in the very last week of the war. And so the poet's rage at the war is echoed, if you like, with the reader's rage that his life was cut short, so close to being saved. And this idea to being so close to salvation, yet still being killed, is the central image of this poem. The poem begins ironically, but the reader doesn't know this yet. It starts with the Latin motto Dulce et Decorum Est, which means it is sweet and fitting. And anyone of Owen's generation who was educated would have known the Latin meaning for this. And the context and the idea behind it is that dying for your country in war is a sweet and fitting sacrifice. So the reader in 1917 is expecting this to be a pro-war poem. They're not expecting the sudden attack against war. Instead of a heroic portrait, the poem begins with weakness, bent double like old beggars under sacks. The effect of the alliteration on B's and D's here is harsh, slowing down time, emphasising in these plosive sounds how difficult it is for these men to walk. And this is picked up with the simile, where these young men are deliberately being contrasted with old beggars. And instead of old men, the word beggars asks us to wonder what it is the boys, the men, are begging for. Is it for their old lives? Is it for their futures? Is it for understanding from the reader at home who doesn't know the full horror of war? Next, the soldiers are shown as ill, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, and in this new simile, hags are old females, so they have become emasculated. Their masculinity has been taken away as well as their youth. This shows how unnatural war is. And as a result of this, the men curse through sludge, cursing as though turning against God. We're reminded perhaps of the hags, the witches in Macbeth, who literally cursed, perhaps suggesting that the evil nature of war has made the men themselves become evil. And again, you'll notice the deliberate repeated alliteration here: knock, kneed, coughing, cursed. Again, harsh sounds, emphasising not just the harsh conditions, but the harsh feelings of anger that the poet is feeling, which again is revealed through the word cursed. In the next line, Owen changes the mood. Till on the haunting flares we turned our backs. I've underlined here the long vowel sounds that stretches this moment out. And why? Well, because it emphasises how these memories are haunting him. The flares themselves are haunting them, like ghosts, but also like an image of hope. Flares traditionally suggest rescue, but they are turning away metaphorically from rescue. They don't believe they can be saved. And of course, we associate the word haunting with death, as though they are haunted by their own deaths, which echoes the speed at which they're aging and becoming much closer to death. This image is picked up with the metaphor of our distant rest. Yes, that's where they're heading, out of the front line, but it's also a euphemism for death. Next, the descriptions become unnatural. The men march to sleep, which would be impossible, except we remember that horses can sleep standing up, and men have become horse-like. The point is emphasised further here, so their feet are covered not in boots, but they are bloodshod. They're covered in blood. But literally the blood has become the shoe that they walk on. Again, this suggests the destruction of their own bodies, but looked at more closely also suggests the fact that they're walking across or through the blood of others, not just their enemies, but presumably their friends who have died next to them. Like horses, they have become lame, and of course a lame horse is put out of its misery and shot, an allusion that Owen knows his readers will bring to the poem, and therefore he doesn't have to spell it out. He shows how they're blind, not just in the physical sense, which again shows their decline in health, but also they're blind to what is going on, similar to the idea that they've turned their backs on it. And perhaps they've turned their backs on their former goodness. Remember, they've become evil. They're cursing. And now we see that tiredness, fatigue, has made them drunk. This metaphor again is ironic. It shows the decline in their mental faculties, but it also shows how they're giving into it, as though they're ready for death. And in this first stanza we can see how Owen has been playing with the sounds of words, and he does it again here by suggesting that he himself and his men are the opposite to us, the readers. We can appreciate the visual imagery, but he himself can't because he and his men are blind. We can appreciate the effect of the alliteration, but he and his men can't appreciate anything because they've become deaf. They're becoming less than human, or if human, less than functional. And then this final line has the alliteration of the S sound, which you'll remember is sibilance, and it's there for an onomatopoeic effect. It's there to recreate the sound of gas shells, so deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. These repeated S's are like the escaping sound of the gas. Again, the sound is ironic. He presents it as a soft, gentle sound, but of course it brings with it the full horror of death, and a very painful death at that. This is a contemporary photograph. Here you can see the soldier who doesn't have his gas mask on, unlike these here, reaching out in agony as his throat begins to burn from the inside, as will his lungs. And Owen wants to bring this kind of picture, which wouldn't have been published widely during the First World War, to a wider readership through his poetry. The change in sound next is masterful, so you'll notice that all these words are one syllable long, creating a sense of urgency. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! You'll notice the harsh sounds of the G's and the Q and the B, suggesting what a harsh fate awaits them. And then that sibilance again, of S of gas and boys, suddenly becomes much more sinister. It's not the soft sound of before, it's much more urgent. Then the dash here balances a much slower description, an ecstasy of fumbling. It takes much longer to say. Why? Because that delay, that extra time, is what's going to kill them rather. They needed to be quick here to get their masks on, but the ecstasy of fumbling shows that the extra increase in time will kill them. And again, here we have the ironic word, an ecstasy is joy and pleasure. And the irony is perhaps they would enjoy dying, but of course they won't, as we shall discover. The death is quite horrific. You'll notice too that they're no longer described as men, but Wilfred Owen wants to point out that they're just boys, truly vulnerable victims. Next, the alliteration of the T's reminds us of time, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. The rhythm that you've got here is completely different. It's celebratory. Those of you who've watched Mary Poppins will recognise this as one of the lyrics, Step in Time. It's got that same cheerful rhythm to it, but this is ironic. It's ironic because the people who have managed to get the helmets on are happy because they're not going to die, but they've just escaped death and they're going to watch others die. The description, as you'd expect now, is both horrific and ironic, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. The simile here suggests the great pain of burning, fire. Lime as well burns. If you get it on your skin, it's like an acid. But it's also used in mass burial graves. For example, during the plague, lime was put on top of the bodies, literally to disinfect them and cause them to decay really quickly. This, if you like, is an image of hell, but it's a hell on earth. Owen also slows down time here with these red underlinings, using the past continuous. This participle, the ing ending, stretches out the event as though it's still happening in the past. Fumbling, fitting, yelling, stumbling, floundering. It's as though the poet is still haunted by this image and he simply can't shake it off, he can't get rid of it. It's still happening now in his head, even though he's describing something that's happened in the past. And of course that's the image he wants to put in the reader's mind. It's incredibly cinematic. Now the description of the man's death in slow motion, the man who's breathing in the gas, is described in an almost gentle way. He's being ironic again. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. The very sound of it sounds like he's describing something glorious, but ironically, because it's not glorious at all. The repetition of green is a symbol of new life, and again this is deeply ironic because this is new death. You'll also notice the return of the long vowel sounds, which again draws out the softness of this and draws out the time. So this death lasts longer. It sounds soft, but remember that again is ironic because it just extends the time for the pain, for the man dying. Once the death becomes more real, Owen gets rid of similes and replaces them with metaphors. If you think about it, that's really appropriate because a metaphor says something is something else. It's much more immediate than a simile, which asks us to imagine why one thing is like another. And so here the gas has become a green sea, and it almost literally is because the man's drowning in it, drinking in the gas as you might drink in the sea. There is another layer of irony here because the poet is watching through misty panes as though not really there. It's not really happening in front of him, it's happening at a distance, which is caused by the misted up glass of his gas mask. This symbolises how he wants to escape what he's actually seeing, and of course everything we've discussed here shows how he can't escape it, and the vision keeps returning to him again and again. The past is replaying itself constantly in his head. Now he's quite clear about his motive. He wants to put us in the same position that he's in. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. Now we can start to hear his anger, and it's his anger at his helplessness, and he wants us to feel that helplessness. Well, where did that anger come from? It came from these harsh sounding consonants, the G and the T, the ch, the ch, the harsh k, the harsh t, and again the g at the end. guttering, choking, drowning. Again, and these polysyllabic words here build up a rhythm, pushing us endlessly towards death. There is also an accusation here of the dead man accusing the survivor, and this is why the death appears in all my dreams, not just in some of them, and he doesn't plunge in my dream, or he doesn't plunge towards me, but directly at me, says the poet, as though in accusation, anger at his own death. And we might see this as Owen's survivor's guilt, feeling that he too should have died with his men. You can easily see this anger in a more contemporary image here, an illustration. Here is the helpless soldier, but we can feel the anger of the dying man who is so close to salvation but simply can't get there because he doesn't have the gas mask, he didn't get it on in time. And now the poet transfers his anger to the reader, which we get with this introduction of you. We're directly placed in the poem. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace. And so the sibilance of the S here becomes more sinister, doesn't it? Again, he's slowing down time. The sibilance does that, as does the ing ending to the verbs, so that we're living the dream, or nightmare if you like, with the poet. Next we have an alliteration of this W sound, w, 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 like a man trying to speak but unable to breathe. Behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face. The anger is now conveyed in his instruction to us, this imperative verb, watch, and this description of the agony of the dying soldier writhing as though in extreme pain, and again that ing ending that keeps the death happening right in front of us. So it's in front of our face. Then the repetition, his hanging face, repeating face draws out the time, making it even longer, as does the ing ending. But the repetition of the same word, that single syllable, also conveys his anger. Writhing in his face, his hanging face, we can hear it build up in pitch and rhythm. Now the sibilance becomes much more sinister and angry, like a devil sick of sin. It's almost spat out, and that effect is achieved with these one-syllable words again. It's no coincidence that he now asks us to hear, because we can see, as you've seen here, just how much alliteration he's using to force us to hear this death. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs. Now Owen really skillfully tries to recreate the sound of the man's dying breaths, his coughing, his gargling. So come gargling, we could argue that's definitely an onomatopoeic word, and then from the froth actually recreates through the alliteration of F, and the TH here actually, which I haven't underlined, the sound of froth coming to his lips, and then corrupted, that beginning of corrupted itself sounds like the beginning of a cough. The whole effect is to recreate the horror of the dying man's voice. Next he goes back to similes, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud. One simile on its own is not powerful enough, so he layers it with a second. You'll notice the alliteration again, the B in obscene and bitter and cancer and cud, and of course the harsher sounding sibilance here in obscene and cancer. All these sounds again conveying his anger. And then the next line becoming almost like a hiss of viral, incurable sores on innocent tongues. A hiss of anger mimicking the hiss of the gas. I've included this picture because it reminds me of the kind of mood in the poem. This feels like the poet deliberately looking at us, accusing us, which is why he puts us as you into the poem. And I've also included it so that you could see the kind of mud, the sludge that they were trudging through. Now that we're coming towards the end of the poem, we're used to that technique of irony, so we ask ourselves, when he calls us, the reader, my friend, is he doing it ironically? Are we, in fact, his enemy? Because we have allowed this war to continue. Worse than that, we've celebrated it, and we've celebrated the sacrifice of the young men who've gone to die. Next, he conveys his horror at us, the readers, who are sending these to die, with this extraordinary phrase here: you would not tell with such high zest. You probably won't see that phrase repeated. If you Google search it, I'll be interested to see how many times it comes up, not being a reference to this poem. This idea of zest, energy and pleasure in energy is deeply ironic, because it's the opposite of the description of the men that we've had in the poem. His anger is again conveyed by the fact that this zest, sending people to war, is directed at children. And he reminds us, as you remember with the word boys, that the men who are fighting are actually no more than boys. Some of them, of course, joined up much younger than the 18 years that they were supposed to be. And my grandfather was one of them, in fact. Again, his anger is conveyed with the word some. So to children, ardent for some desperate glory. And the word some here suggests that the desperate glory is illusory, it's not real. And that's, of course, backed up by the fact that it's desperate. These boys are desperate to grow up, to contribute, to help. And we tell them a great lie by sending them off to their deaths. And that's the point made in the next line. His anger is extreme here, and that's why the lie has a capital. It's an old lie that's been around for a long time, so he's deeply angry that this myth that it's sweet and fitting to die for your country is perpetuated through the generations. But there's another meaning of old here. The old, of course, don't have to go to war, and they are sending the young people to their deaths. So this is another reason he's accusing the readers, and why calling us his friend is an ironic attack. We're the people who are growing old and happy, and it's the young who are dying for our happiness. Now we can see more of the purpose of the title. The word dulce, meaning sweet, is deliberately contrasted with the bitter taste in the mouth of the dying soldier, bitter as the cud, remember, and it's also the bitter taste in the words used by the poet. Again, there has been nothing decorous about the death. In fact, it's been horrifying, not elegant at all. Pro patria mori means to die for your country, but there's been no reference to that in the poem at all. In fact, the soldier hasn't died in any kind of heroic way. He hasn't been fighting somebody else. He simply died almost by accident because he wasn't able to get his gas mask on in time. His death, then, has been completely and utterly pointless. And Owen picks on this because it's a wider metaphor. All these deaths have been pointless. And a final way of showing that is the fact that this quotation is in Latin. It comes to us from the Romans. A pointless sacrifice that's been going on for 2,000 years. Empires and countries do not last, and Owen is asking the question, are they really worth dying for? I'd like to end by considering aspects of the structure of this poem. So the first thing you'll notice is that the lines are usually 10 syllables long, but when a poet deviates from this, it's a clue that they're doing so for a reason. So if we look at this line here, the 9-syllable line, of gas shells dropping behind, we might say something like the drop in syllables reflects the urgency of what's about to happen. They're not prepared for it, just like the stanza isn't prepared. It doesn't have the right number of syllables in it. And then that extra syllable drops to the next line. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling. That extra syllable makes the line take more time, which matches exactly with what's happening to the man who has not got on his gas mask in time. Similarly, that extra bit of time is needed here, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling. That's the moment when the gas gets to him, which is why it's an 11-syllable line. This is the moment in which he actually takes too long. And similarly, it happens here, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. But this time the elongated time is not about the soldier dying, it's what's happening to the observer. I saw him drowning takes much more time, as we find out in the next couplet, because in all my dreams he plunges at me. It's happening now, so the poet can't escape it. That's why it's taking so much more time. And then finally, the final line here, pro patria mori, is just 6 syllables long. And I think Owen's doing that to show how incomplete this is as an idea. It's a completely unsatisfying ending to the poem, just as these deaths are completely unsatisfying ways of ending life. The deaths are pointless. If you want to study the structure in more depth, it will be worth looking at the emphasis he places on syllables. So instead of being iambic in nature, it's often trochaic, with the syllables being emphasized with the first sound, bent, knock, men. You'll get this idea of a much more accusing tone by starting with these emphasized syllables at the beginning. And often it happens with every syllable. Gas, gas, quick boys. And come gargling from the froth corrupted lungs. There are no soft syllables in many of the lines, none that are unaccented. In many ways, breaking the classical rules of poetry because he can't control his own anger. So I really hope I've done this poem justice. It's a fantastic, brilliant assault on our senses. In many ways, it's a pity it's a war poem because it's full of horror, and that's not the kind of image that you want to take with you. But it's a poem which has lived with me ever since I first studied it when I was 15, and I hope it does the same for you.